The Renaissance is often remembered as a time of light, creativity, and human achievement. We picture magnificent paintings, groundbreaking scientific discoveries, and a rebirth of classical knowledge. But something about this story feels incomplete. How could an era celebrated for humanism, reason, and beauty coincide with exploitation, brutal power struggles, and the growth of slavery on a massive scale? Did the Renaissance really lift humanity to new heights, or was it a gilded age built on the suffering of others? In this video, we're going to explore the dark side of the Renaissance, the realities that history textbooks rarely highlight. We'll uncover the role of slavery, the hidden mechanisms of power, and the ways wealth and art were intertwined with human suffering. When we look at the popular image of the Renaissance, we see Florence, Venice, and Rome as centers of art and intellect. Wealthy patrons like the Medici family funded Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Botticelli. Artists flourished, and humanist philosophy thrived. But behind these achievements was a system that depended heavily on exploitation both of people and resources. The trade networks that funded European wealth were deeply tied to slavery. African and indigenous peoples were captured, traded, and forced into labor that supported the economic and cultural flowering in Europe. Without this hidden labor, much of the Renaissance's grandeur would have been impossible. The connection between slavery and Renaissance wealth was not abstract. Venice, for example, relied on trade across the Mediterranean, often facilitated by enslaved labor. Slaves worked in shipyards, homes, and workshops, enabling the accumulation of capital by merchants and nobles. Similarly, the Medici fortune, which funded Florence's art and architecture, was connected indirectly to trade networks that exploited enslaved people. In short, the beauty we admire today often had a dark foundation in human suffering. Power dynamics during the Renaissance also reveal another uncomfortable truth. Wealth and influence were concentrated in the hands of a few families, city-states, and monarchs, who maintained control through patronage, alliances, and coercion. Political power was frequently enforced through violence, intimidation, and manipulation. Popular uprisings were crushed with extreme brutality, demonstrating that the humanist ideals celebrated in philosophy and art were often reserved for the elite. Thinkers like Machiavelli analyzed power pragmatically, describing the strategies rulers used to maintain control strategies that rarely considered justice or the welfare of ordinary people. Even as intellectuals wrote about freedom, morality, and human dignity, the structures of society relied on stark inequality. Peasants, artisans, and slaves had little protection under the law. Their labor funded the artistic and scientific achievements we now revere, yet they rarely enjoyed the benefits. Some historians argue that the Renaissance was a golden age for a select few, while much of the population lived under conditions of oppression and economic precarity. Colonial ambitions also began during this period. European powers were expanding overseas, driven by trade, wealth, and competition. Early ventures into Africa and the Americas were often justified using religious and cultural narratives, framing conquest and exploitation as part of a civilizing mission. Yet the reality was far more brutal. Indigenous populations were enslaved, displaced, and decimated. The human cost of these early colonial enterprises was enormous, and the wealth extracted from colonies directly fueled Renaissance art, architecture, and intellectual projects. Religion, often celebrated as a moral guiding force, was deeply intertwined with power and exploitation. The Catholic Church was a major patron of the arts, commissioning grand works that today inspire awe. But the Church also wielded immense political influence, often suppressing dissent, reinforcing social hierarchies, and legitimizing slavery and conquest. Art and religious devotion were inseparable from political and economic interests, demonstrating that the Renaissance's glory was inseparable from mechanisms of control and oppression. Scientific and technological advances were another aspect of Renaissance life that carried a hidden cost. Innovations in navigation, shipbuilding, and weaponry enabled European powers to expand overseas, dominate trade routes, and enforce colonial and slave systems. While celebrated as human ingenuity, these advances often facilitated conquest and the subjugation of entire populations. The Renaissance's intellectual achievements, in this light, cannot be separated from the violent and exploitative systems that enabled them. Even within Europe, racial and social hierarchies were reinforced during the Renaissance. The concept of a civilized versus uncivilized world became more pronounced, justifying slavery and the exploitation of marginalized groups. African, Middle Eastern, and Romani people were often enslaved or subjected to discriminatory laws, while European elites rationalized their own privilege through cultural and religious arguments. The Renaissance, celebrated for humanist thought, coexisted with widespread social exclusion and oppression. Art itself, while a symbol of beauty and intellectual achievement, frequently reflected and reinforced these power structures. Portraits glorified wealthy patrons. Monumental architecture displayed the power of ruling families, and commissioned works often celebrated conquest or divine favor. Ordinary people, laborers, and enslaved individuals rarely appear in the grand narratives of art history, yet they were essential to creating it. Even the depictions of exotic peoples in paintings and literature often reinforced stereotypes and justified exploitation. In short, the Renaissance cannot be understood simply as a period of enlightenment and progress. Its brilliance was inseparable from the systems of power, slavery, and exploitation that underpinned it. Every statue, painting, and scientific discovery was connected, directly or indirectly, to human labor, often coerced or enslaved. Every philosophical treatise or humanist text coexisted with political structures that prioritized wealth, control, and hierarchy over justice. The paradox of the Renaissance is clear. It produced extraordinary cultural and intellectual achievements while simultaneously reinforcing oppression and inequality. By examining the hidden realities behind the beauty and innovation, we gain a fuller understanding of this pivotal era. The Renaissance was not a purely golden age, but a complex period where creativity and cruelty were closely intertwined, where human genius and human suffering existed side by side. As we delve deeper into the Renaissance, the role of slavery and coerced labor becomes even more apparent. Venice, Genoa, and Florence were not isolated in their dependence on enslaved people. They were hubs in a broader Mediterranean system that spanned North Africa, the Middle East, and later, Sub-Saharan Africa. Enslaved people were employed in households, workshops, and the shipyards that produced the vessels enabling trade and military expansion. Even celebrated artistic masterpieces relied on the labor of workers who remained anonymous and unrecognized, many of whom were living under harsh, often brutal conditions. The wealth generated through this exploitation funded the very culture and intellectual achievements that historians often celebrate as emblematic of human progress. The Medici family provides a striking example. Known as patrons of the arts and champions of humanist philosophy, the Medici fortune was built not just on banking and trade, but also on their involvement in Mediterranean commerce, which included networks tied to slavery. Their support of artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci is legendary, but it was financed by systems that profited from human suffering. Without this infrastructure, it's hard to imagine Florence producing the cultural flowering that later defined the Renaissance. Art and philosophy were intertwined with wealth, power, and exploitation in ways that the glowing narrative of the era often obscures. Colonial ambitions, which gained momentum during the later Renaissance, also shed light on the hidden costs of the period. European exploration was often portrayed as a noble quest for knowledge and trade, but the reality involved violent conquest, enslavement, and the forced integration of indigenous populations into European economic systems. Portuguese and Spanish expeditions in Africa and the Americas relied heavily on the enslavement of local populations, both for labor and to establish political control. These ventures brought enormous wealth back to European powers, funding further exploration, building projects, and the patronage of culture and art. Renaissance achievement, therefore, was inseparable from the early colonial exploitation that would shape global history for centuries. Religion, which often served as a guiding moral force, was deeply entangled with power and oppression during the Renaissance. The Catholic Church's patronage fueled some of the era's most famous artistic achievements. Yet the institution also reinforced social hierarchies, justified wars of conquest, and sanctioned slavery. Papal bulls occasionally authorized the subjugation of non-Christian peoples. demonstrating how religious authority was deployed to legitimize exploitation. The church as wealth and influence were thus built not only on spiritual leadership, but also on systems of power and coercion. The same hands that commissioned Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling also supported mechanisms of oppression that reached across continents. Even scientific progress, celebrated as a hallmark of Renaissance humanism, had darker undercurrents. Advancements in navigation, cartography, and shipbuilding enabled European powers to dominate trade routes, project military force overseas, and control populations far from their homelands. These technological achievements were often justified in the name of discovery and knowledge, but in practice, they facilitated the control, displacement, and exploitation of millions of people. The Renaissance's intellectual achievements cannot be separated from the human and ethical costs of these advances, which often reinforced global hierarchies of power. Social hierarchies within Europe also reinforced oppression. The Renaissance was not a time of equality. It was an age where wealth, lineage, and access to education determined status and opportunity. Peasants, artisans, and enslaved workers had limited rights, and their labor funded the wealth and cultural achievements of the elite. Popular revolts, such as the Ciompi uprising in Florence, were violently suppressed, demonstrating that the celebrated humanism of the era often excluded those who produced the very wealth and labor that made art and philosophy possible. Power was concentrated, maintained through coercion, and justified by intellectual and cultural narratives that masked exploitation. Art and literature, while often portrayed as celebrations of beauty and intellect, also reinforced social hierarchies and justified power structures. Portraits immortalized wealthy patrons, monumental architecture displayed the dominance of ruling families, and commissioned works glorified conquest, religion, or divine favor. Ordinary people, laborers, and enslaved individuals were largely absent from these narratives, even though their contributions were essential. Exoticized depictions of non-European peoples in paintings and literature often reinforced stereotypes and legitimized colonial and slave systems. Art, in this context, was both a product of and a justification for systems of oppression. The paradox of the Renaissance lies in this coexistence of brilliance and brutality. On one hand, it was an era of extraordinary intellectual and artistic achievement. On the other, it was deeply dependent on exploitation, inequality, and violence. Understanding this duality allows us to see the Renaissance not as a purely golden age, but as a period in which creativity and cruelty were intertwined. Human genius flourished alongside human suffering, and progress for some came at a profound cost for others. Historians increasingly recognize that these contradictions were not incidental, they were structural. The economic, social, and political systems of the time created incentives that rewarded exploitation, concentrated wealth, and enabled elite cultural flourishing. Slavery, colonial expansion, political coercion, and social hierarchies were not side effects of Renaissance progress, they were integral to it. By examining these realities, we can move beyond the romanticized narrative of the Renaissance and confront the full complexity of its history. The lessons of the Renaissance are relevant even today. Modern societies often celebrate achievements in art, science, and culture without fully acknowledging the human costs behind them. Wealth accumulation, systemic inequality, and the exploitation of vulnerable populations continue to shape global dynamics. By understanding the Renaissance in all its complexity, we gain a clearer perspective on the intersection of culture, power, and morality. We see that progress is rarely purely virtuous and that brilliance often coexists with injustice. In conclusion, the Renaissance was not merely an age of light, reason, and humanism. Its achievements were intertwined with systems of slavery, oppression, and power that shaped both Europe and the wider world. Art, science, and intellectual advancement were enabled by labor and exploitation, while wealth and influence remained concentrated in the hands of the few. The humanist ideals celebrated in philosophy and literature coexisted with coercion, inequality, and conquest. By exploring the dark side of the Renaissance, we gain a more nuanced understanding of the era, a reminder that history's brightest moments often cast the longest shadows. The Renaissance remains a period of incredible human achievement, but it is inseparable from the suffering, exploitation, and power dynamics that underpin it. Recognizing these truths does not diminish the era's accomplishments. It deepens our understanding and challenges us to reflect on how progress is achieved, at whose expense, and at what cost.